Well, this video is entitled Daniel's 70th Week and the Seals of Revelation, and this is in the context of the 7-year journey of the planet Jupiter, otherwise known to the ancient Hebrews as Zedek, the planet of the Messiah, from the woman of Revelation 12 to the horns of the wild ox in the time period from 2017 to 2024. Now, this is the basic structure of the 70th week of Daniel, which is a 7-year period. We're assuming, or the hypothesis is that when the planet Jupiter was birthed from Virgo on the 15th of October of 2017, that would mark the onset possibly of the 70th week. And we found that the day counts that are required were respected by this date, and that the first half was 1,260 days from this date all the way to the Passover date of 28 March 2021, when I would expect the stop of sacrifices to occur, followed in the middle of Passover week by the abomination of desolation on the 1st of April. Then the second half of the 70th week would be 1,290 days. We found that from the abomination of desolation on the 1st of April to the Day of Atonement, 12 October 2024, that was exactly 1,290 days. So we've also looked at eclipses that were important during this 7-year period, as well as other celestial alignments, and found that they did in fact correlate to geopolitical events that had to do with division of the land of the everlasting covenant, which is the proximate cause of judgment as described in Joel chapter 3 and Isaiah 24. Now we're going to discover whether or not this hypothesis meshes very well with the seals of Revelation, which also is a time period of Daniel's 70th week. So on the 15th of October 2017 is the hypothetical start of Daniel's 70th week, if that birth is indeed related to Micah 5:3, which says that Messiah will give up his people until the time that she who is in labor is given birth. And so we see that on this date, we see that Jupiter is actually birthed from Virgo on that date. Now we found that the result of Revelation 12, that we can actually see on earth the outcome of the spiritual warfare that's described between Michael and the dragon, is that the fiery dragon is thrown down to the earth, and woe to the earth because of that, while the heavens rejoice. And we find that the result is that the dragon is very angry, and he pursues the woman and also those that hold to the testimony of Jesus. In other words, there's great persecution of Jews and Christians that should mark the onset or the first part of Daniel's 70th week. Now, Revelation 12:5 and 6 states this: the woman fled into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so she would be nourished for 1,260 days. And so we have a day count that we have to attach to the birth of Zedek from Virgo, and we have to account for that specific day count of 1,260 days, which suggests that the woman is relatively protected during that time. Revelation 12:14 goes on to say the 2 wings of the great eagle were given to the woman, so that she could fly into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time, times, and half a time from the presence of the serpent. So again, a 3.5-year period, the woman is relatively protected. It's interesting, it's by the wings of the great eagle. And considering who Israel's great protector is these days, and the fact that America is represented by the eagle, that's just of interest. But again, there's relative protection for the first half of the 70th week given to Israel. So let's see how well that meshes with this first seal, Revelation seal 1, verse 6-2. Lo, a white horse, and he who is sitting upon it is having a bow, and there was given to him a crown, and he went forth overcoming, and that he may overcome. Now, in his video on Who Rides the White Horse, my friend and colleague Nelson Walters has a fantastic video which describes the rider of the white horse, and I'd highly recommend that you watch this. I've provided the URL here, but he has a channel on YouTube, and you can look that up, Nelson Walters on YouTube, where he has published scores of videos on very interesting topics and that are helpful, I believe, in these times. And I particularly agreed with him on his video of the white horse. Now, in his video, Nelson describes the bow that the rider has as a sign of deceit. Bow is equated with deceit in its Old Testament usage. Jesus is never pictured as having a bow. He's pictured with having a sword. However, bow indicates deceit. The rider is one of deceit, a false Christ, if you will. Now, the crown that he was given, the Greek word is Stephanos, and this word, as Nelson points out, is the crown of a victor in a contest. It's not a crown of a ruler, which would be diadem. Now, it's interesting to me that in the Latin Vulgate, the Latin translation, the crown is corona, and that's just interesting to me in light of the times that we're currently in. The word overcome is Greek. The Greek word is nikeo. Now, overcome is used predominantly for nikeo throughout the Bible. Now, in some translations, overcome is translated as conquer and to conquer. However, overcome and to overcome is really a better translation, and that comprises the majority of the translations of nikeo. Now, the way it's used in this verse is not only is it a present participle, he is overcoming, but he is going out to overcome, which implies a future overcoming as well. Now, in what sense are people being overcome? Well, if the writer is one of a demonic spiritual being or a demonic spiritual influence, I would suggest that that he is active in the earth, overcoming people spiritually. And unless one has Christ in their heart, they are increasingly influenced to hate-filled acts and violence. If Christ is in your heart, you're immune to that. You can't be overcome by these spiritual influences, these demonic spiritual influences, as represented by the first writer. And we're all familiar with this scene, and this is reminiscent of the time of the Vietnam War in America. We have the same kinds of events happening in our streets even today. But more specifically, in the outcome of the 12th chapter of Revelation, we see anti-Semitism on a marked rise, and Jew hatred is sprouting all over the world, as is evidenced in this picture, and I believe we're all aware of this. It's hard to believe that just a few decades after the Holocaust, we have individuals that would put together a sign like this. And this, again, is just evidence of the increasing anti-Semitic hatred that is going on in the world, in line with the signs of Revelation 12. Now, in the first video, I showed this bar graph, which again showed the big spike in anti-Semitic incidents over the last decade, and that spike began in 2017 and is being maintained even today. And this type of behavior is going on all over the world, which would be in line, again, with Revelation 12 and the opening of the first seal. But it's not just the Jewish people that are being increasingly persecuted, but Christians as well. And this scene of the Egyptian Christians being beheaded on a beach in Libya certainly would be considered tribulation to them. These types of events have been increasing throughout the world, especially in places like Nigeria and Iraq, Iran. China is closing down churches and putting members under arrest. So all around the world, we see Christian persecution on the rise simultaneous to that of Jewish persecution. And this map, also from the first video, is the 2020 World Watch List map of areas of considerable Christian persecution throughout the world, and which has been increasing. We also saw from the first video that at the time of the birth of Zedek from the woman in labor in the fall of 2017, that at the same time Jared Kushner flew to Riyadh, Saudi Arabia to present the plan to divide the land of the everlasting covenant. And this was strongly endorsed by Mohammed bin Salman and the Saudi government, which would serve to satisfy the Hebrew of Daniel 9:27, in which he caused the plan to be strengthened by throwing his support behind it. It remains to be seen whether or not the rider of the white horse and the demonic influences will further influence these people, or in fact empower them going forward. Now, immediately after the birth of Zedek from Virgo, the son, was taken up to the throne of God, which we found to be equivalent to the constellation of Libra. At the same exact time that Jupiter left Virgo to transit to Libra, we found that Saturn, the Satan planet, was thrown out of Ophiuchus into the constellation of Sagittarius, being thrown to Earth. So what we have here is the date is the 15th of October 2017, and on that date Jupiter here is leaving the constellation Virgo. So this is the birth date of Jupiter. Jupiter has been hanging out in Virgo for the better part of a year. Now, on the date that Jupiter is birthed, it is going to head straight to the throne of God, which is Libra, right here. And what I want you to notice at the same time is that Saturn is here, and it is in Ophiuchus, the serpent wrestler. Saturn, the Satan planet, has been present in Ophiuchus for the better part of a year. Now, simultaneous to Jupiter heading to Libra, Saturn is going to head to Sagittarius on the same day. So I'm going to show you that animation. And here we go. Watch Jupiter and Saturn. Simultaneous to Jupiter going to Libra, we have Saturn arriving in Sagittarius. So I think this is a pictorial representation of the child being born and going to the throne of God at the same time that Saturn, the Satan planet, is thrown out of Ophiuchus to Sagittarius. Now this artist's rendition of Ophiuchus shows the man wrestling the serpent. And this brings to mind possibly the idea of Michael the angel wrestling with Satan and throwing him to earth. And when he was thrown to earth, he ended up in the constellation Sagittarius, which just happens to be the rider on a horse with a bow. So in year one, after the birth of Zedek on the 15th of October 2017, we find that Zedek, or Jupiter, is still contained within the throne of God. Saturn, the Satan planet, is now in Sagittarius. It's interesting also that Pluto is in Sagittarius, and on this particular date in 2018 is having a conjunction with the planet Mars, which depicts war. So I think it would be fair to say that if Satan is indeed thrown to earth, that we have seen more than our share of anti-Semitic and anti-Christian behavior, as well as deranged, insane hatreds that would be evidence that demonic forces are on the earth influencing people spiritually to these forms of behavior. This brings us to the second seal, Revelation 6:4. And another, a red horse went out, and to him who sat on it, it was granted to take peace from the earth, and that men would slay one another. And a great sword was given to him. Now, Jesus spoke of nation rising against nation and kingdom against kingdom in the Olivet Discourse. And that corresponds to the red horse, the second seal of Revelation. And just off the top of my head, these are all countries where there are active armed conflicts ongoing, some within insurgencies within that country, but others are full-blown wars, as in the case of Syria and Yemen, with outside actors involved. And this is not a complete list by any means, but all of these countries are now experiencing armed conflicts. And this is a world map showing areas where there are currently armed conflicts within those countries. Mexico is listed not because it's in war, although there were more people killed in Mexico than any of the other wars. And this is because they have a drug war going on. So all over the world, we have armed conflicts. And this map doesn't include the actors that may be involved in those wars, such as the United States or Russia or Iran for that matter. All of these countries have troops in other countries and are actively engaged in warfare. Not only do we have wars around the world, but we also have rumors of war. Kashmir, for instance, where we have two nuclear armed powers, Pakistan and India, facing off with constant intermittent fighting. We also have North Korea, who's in the process of developing ballistic missiles long range for its nuclear weapons. We have China, who's laid claim to the South China Sea and is preventing countries from free navigation through that area. We have Iran, who is busy around the world funding and arming insurgencies in the Middle East and elsewhere. And then we have Israel, which practically on a daily basis is bombing its enemies in Syria and at times Lebanon as well, or even Iraq, as it tries to protect itself from the threats of its neighbors and enemies. Now, the rider of the red horse was given a great sword. He didn't come out with one. And to me, that implies he's being armed. And we currently have an arms race going on around the world. Hypersonic missiles are the newest item, and around the world, including the United States, countries are trying to develop this capability. The Russians have actually made it operational. And so we have an arms race that is going on. Iran is thought to be well within a year of obtaining its own nuclear weapon, and in spite of denials, intelligence sources have discovered that in fact it has continued to work towards obtaining nuclear capability. I think it's a fair question to ask, well, haven't we always seen wars and rumors of wars around the world and false Christs and famines and plagues and martyrs? And the answer is yes, we have. We have seen that. But I believe that God has used the celestial alignments possibly to give us a clue that this is the time that they're important. So now in the first couple of years after October 15th, 2017, we would anticipate war, death, judgment, and we still see that Jupiter or Zedek is in the throne of God, which represents judgment. We have Saturn, the Satan planet, still in Sagittarius, having been thrown to Earth. Here on April the 2nd, 2018, there's a conjunction of Mars, the god of war, with Saturn in Sagittarius. And we still see Pluto or Hades there as well. So I believe that we do have celestial representation of what is depicted not only in the Olivet Discourse, but in the first two seals of Revelation. Moving on to the third seal, Revelation 6, 5, and 6, behold, a black horse, and he who sat on it had a pair of scales in his hand, and I heard a voice in the center of the four living creatures saying, a quart of wheat for a denarius, and 3 quarts of barley for a denarius, and do not damage the oil and the wine. Now, a denarius was a day's wage, a quart of wheat was a day's ration, so food is going to be very expensive, possibly short. We could even see famine, and that's what the black horse seems to imply. Well, in 2019, China again experienced the African swine fever in its pig herds, and they actually had to kill up to 2/3 of their swine herd, which was as many as 400 million pigs out of 600 million. And this is one of their major protein sources. And so because of the African swine fever epidemic, they had to liquidate their pig herds. And the liquidation of those pig herds in China led to skyrocketing pork prices, where they more than tripled. And you can see this from this graph, which extends into the fourth quarter of 2019. The price of pork skyrocketed as a result of food shortage. It's also feared that because of the coronavirus epidemic that there will be difficulty with food distribution, and that from panic buying and lockdowns around the world, combined with flaws in distributing that food, that we could see food shortages, and which could also drive world food price inflation. And behind the scenes, we have a biblical plague of locusts, which began in South and East Africa and now has extended throughout South Asia, including India and Pakistan, even into Western China. It has, in many areas, been described as the worst locust plague that they've seen in over 70 years. And coronavirus, again, is complicating efforts to eradicate these locusts because travel has been shut down. The pesticides are not reaching the areas where they're needed, and therefore these locusts in many areas are being left unchecked, where they're devouring crops in an area where people are already food short and have very marginal food supplies. Now in Luke 21, the Luke 21 version of the Olivet Discourse, Jesus connects famines to plagues. He says, "Then he continued by saying to them, Nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, and there will be great earthquakes, and in various places plagues and famines, and there will be terrors and great signs from heaven." So Luke connects plagues and famines. Matthew just mentions famines, but Luke also connects them to plagues and also to great signs in heaven. And speaking of plagues, we've all by now heard of coronavirus, which in just a few months has spread worldwide into a new pandemic. And as of this date, April the 5th, there's over 1.25 million cases and approaching 70,000 deaths. And this number is surely to rise markedly in the coming months. And this slide shows total cases on the left on a linear graph, and then total deaths on the right. And they're both still increasing exponentially, as can be seen, without any flattening whatsoever on this curve as of this date, April the 5th. Now, it turns out that China reported its first cases to the World Health Organization on December the 31st, New Year's Eve, 2019. And they reported 44 cases. Some of those probably were present in late November, but they didn't report them to the World Health Organization until 12/31. Now it's interesting that on 12/29, just 2 days prior to that report from China, a discovery was made of a new comet that has never been seen before. They could calculate from its orbit that the last time that it visited our area was 5,500 years ago. So this comet is enormous. It's the size of the planet Jupiter. And you can currently see it with binoculars as it's near the Big Dipper. But by the end of April into early May, it will become visible with the naked eye. And it's thought that this comet is going to be bright enough to be the second brightest object in the night sky after the moon, surpassing even the brightness of Venus. Not only that, it gives off this pale green color. which is going to be of interest, I believe. So when we're talking about the fourth seal, famines and then plagues, and then Luke ties in signs of heaven, we see that the new coronavirus, CV-19, was reported first on 12/31 and has led to a worldwide pandemic. 2 days prior to the report to the World Health Organization, the comet C-19 Atlas was discovered. Now, Atlas in ancient Greek means to suffer or to endure, because Atlas was the Greek titan who was punished by having to hold the world on his shoulders for eternity. And so the meaning of that name is to suffer. And it gives off, again, the pale green color, which in Greek, the word is chloros. So at the beginning of the third year of the hypothetical 70th week of Daniel, on the 15th of October 2019, we would anticipate war, death, famine, and plague. And we find that Zedek, or Jupiter, has left Libra and is now in Ophiuchus, the serpent wrestler. Saturn, the Satan planet, is still within Sagittarius, and Pluto is still also within Sagittarius. Now, as the days advance, these planets move from right to left. So it would appear at this point that Saturn is following Pluto. And then we have the interesting discovery of the new pale green chloros comet named C-19 Atlas. And now on to the fourth seal, Revelation 6, verse 8. Behold, an ashen horse, and he who sat on it had the name Death, and Hades was following with him. Authority was given to them over a fourth of the earth to kill with sword and with famine and with pestilence and by the wild beasts of the earth. Now, when we think of the name Death, which was the name of the rider of the fourth horse, the image of a grim reaper might come to mind, a shrouded figure armed with a sickle, which was noted in the Middle Ages during the time of the Black Death. But if we go back a little further, it's even more interesting where this image originated from. It's thought that the image of the Grim Reaper was influenced by Cronus, the Greek god who was armed with a sickle. He was the father of Zeus, and he had deposed his father Uranos. And he was told that one of his children would replace him, which turned out to be Zeus. But because of that fear, Cronus resorted to eating his children when they were born. And that's the story of Cronus. And he is depicted as being armed with a sickle and is associated with harvest as well as death. Now, the Roman name for Cronus is Saturn. That's the planet, representing death or Satan. And here at the beginning of year 4, on the 15th of October 2020, we see that Saturn is still in Sagittarius, but he has moved ahead of Pluto. Pluto is the Roman name for the Greek god Hades, ruler of the underworld. And so since the planets are moving right to left, we can now see that in fact Hades is following death, which would be expected from the fourth seal. So from Revelation 6:8, we have the ashen horse. The Greek word is actually chloros, which means green, the same color that was marked for the comet C-19 Atlas. And I find that interesting. The word for death in this instance is uppercase Thanatos. It's a proper name. Elsewhere in the Bible, when Thanatos is used, it just means death in general, but this is a name. And we can connect that to Cronus, the Greek god who is armed with a sickle and is the equivalent of the Roman planet Saturn. Hades is ruler of the underworld, as he was known in the Greek. However, the Romans renamed him Pluto. So we find that at the beginning of the hypothetical fourth year of Daniel's 70th week, that Hades is indeed following death, as Pluto is following Saturn within Sagittarius. And the death that we see is by the previous seals, war, famine, and plague. Now, the word by the beasts of the earth, actually, as Nelson Walters points out in one of his videos, the Greek word is actually hypo, which means under. So it'd be interesting to think of it that way, that these things are happening under the beasts of Revelation. Now, at the midpoint of the hypothetical 70th week, we come to Passover on the 28th of March, 2021, which is when we would expect the stop to sacrifices to occur, as we mentioned in the first video. And what we find now is that Saturn, the Satan planet, is well within Capricorn, the constellation of the occult. And Saturn hangs out in Capricorn all the way till early 2023, which would be the time that you would expect for the Great Tribulation. On the other hand, Jupiter, or Zedek, has left Capricorn on this date and is headed now for Taurus to complete his 7-year journey when he returns to rule and reign. Now, Jesus said in Matthew 24:15, when you see the abomination of desolation spoken of through Daniel the prophet standing in the holy place, there will be a great tribulation, such as not has occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever shall. Now, tribulation is only used in the Bible to refer to the period after the abomination in the second half of Daniel's 70th week. So the Great Tribulation comprises the last 3.5 years of the 70th week and would begin in the middle of Passover week on April the 1st, 2021, which is when I believe the abomination of desolation would occur. Now, for this to be true, we had to account for day counts, including the day count of Daniel 12, in which 1290 days is timed for everything to be completed after the cessation of sacrifices. And we find that from April the 1st, 2021 to October 12th, 2024, Day of Atonement, in fact, that's exactly 1290 days, as we saw in the second video. And now we come to the fifth seal, Revelation 6:9. When the Lamb broke the fifth seal, I saw underneath the altar the souls of those who had been slain because of the word of God and because of the testimony which they had maintained. And this corresponds to what Jesus preached in the Olivet Discourse in Matthew 24, verses 9 and 10. Then they will deliver you to tribulation and will kill you, and you will be hated by all nations because of my name. At that time, many will fall away and will betray one another and hate one another. And Daniel speaks of the saints being overcome in several places. In Daniel 7, verses 21 and 22, I kept looking, and that horn, that is the Antichrist, was waging war with the saints and overpowering them until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was passed in favor of the saints of the Highest One, and the time arrived when the saints took possession of the kingdom. And so in essence, we know what the final score is, but not before the believers were being overcome. And in Daniel 7:25, he will speak out against the Most High and wear down the saints of the Highest One. And he will intend to make alterations in times and in law, and they will be given into his hand for a time, times, and half a time, referring to the last 3.5 years of Daniel's 70th week, recalling that in the first half of the 70th week, at least the Jewish people were given relative protection. And certainly right now, although we have potentially Satan roaming the earth and overcoming, we haven't reached it to the degree that we will in the second half of the week. And again in Daniel 12, verse 7, I heard the man dressed in linen, and who was above the waters of the river, as he raised his right hand and his left toward heaven, and swore by him who lives forever that it would be for a time, times, and half a time. And as soon as they finish shattering the power of the holy people, all these events will be completed. again looking to the latter half of Daniel's 70th week during the time of what we know will be the Great Tribulation. But the good news is in Matthew 24:22, Jesus states, unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And now coming to the sixth seal, Revelation 6, verses 12 through 17. The sun became black as sackcloth made of hair. The whole moon became like blood. The stars fell from the sky. The sky was split apart like a scroll when it is rolled up, and every mountain and island were moved out of their places. Now, John is describing what he's seeing, the sky being split apart like a scroll. And doesn't this image look like a Jewish scroll laid on its side? And so my belief is that what John is describing at the sixth seal, in addition to the celestial signs that he mentioned and will be a great sign, I believe that he's describing what I think would be a limited nuclear event at the time of the sixth seal. And this is supported by the rest of the passage. The kings of the earth and great men, commanders, rich, strong, every slave and free man, what did they do? They hid themselves in the caves and among the rocks of the mountains. And they said, hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb, for the great day of their wrath has come, and who is able to stand? And the sixth seal corresponds to Isaiah 2, which is a judgment chapter. Verse 19, men will go into caves of the rocks and into the holes of the ground before the terror of the Lord and the splendor of his majesty when he arises to make the earth tremble. So the image of the sky splitting open like a scroll and men hiding underground to get away from the wrath is reminiscent of man's attempt to flee, possibly a limited nuclear event, and the coming wrath of the Lamb. But now for some good news. After these events in Revelation 7, verses 9 and 10, before the opening of the seventh seal, John states it this way, I looked and behold a great multitude which no one could count, from every nation and all tribes and peoples and tongues, standing before the throne and before the Lamb, clothed in white robes. And palm branches were in their hands, and they cry out with a loud voice, saying, to salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. And one of the two elders that is with John at the time answered and said, these who are clothed in the white robes, who are they and where have they come from? Asking John. Well, John, of course, didn't know. My Lord, you know. And he said to me, these are the ones who come out of the great tribulation, and they have washed their robes and made them white in the blood of the Lamb. So these people are redeemed, and they came out of the great tribulation. I believe this is representative of the rapture. It's the first description in John's account of believers identified as such in heaven. But now for some good news. The seventh seal happens after the image of the rapture, which I believe occurs after the sixth seal, when the believers are in heaven, having come out of the great tribulation. They are being spared the wrath of the Lamb, which is defined in Revelation as all the events after the seventh seal. We also have 1 Thessalonians 5:9, which states it this way, for God has not destined us for wrath, but for obtaining salvation through our Lord Jesus Christ. So fortunately, believers will not be around for the horrific events of the seventh seal. Now it's interesting to note that in Matthew 24, when the disciples asked Jesus, what are the signs of your coming and signs of the end of the age? He did not mention a single thing in the seventh seal. And that is because if we're not there, it can't be a sign. And so he didn't discuss it. And I'm not going to discuss it in the context of this video, but the events after the seventh seal are opened would comprise the 7th year of Daniel's 70th week, and we covered some of those events in the second video. So again, we come to the question then, if these things are true, and if this is the hypothetical 70th week of Daniel, which we'll know within a year when we find out whether or not the daily sacrifices are resumed, and then there's a stop to sacrifices around Passover week of 2021, how should we live then as believers? And I have a few things here. I plan to cover more in depth this topic in the next video, the 4th video of the series. But we can do things that the Bible commands us to do, and one is to pray, be in prayer, turn to God. It's going to change our perspective on how we see the world, and all of a sudden God is going to become a lot more personal and relevant. Be alert. Jesus said to be alert and to be prepared. Don't be caught unaware. Be ready to share. We're going to have great opportunities to point to the Savior, share the gospel, share your material things, because pretty soon they won't matter to us. Point to the Messiah and trust in the Savior, calling on the name of the Lord. Thank you for listening today. I hope to have the 4th video out, hopefully within the next week or two. And the topic will be, what should we be doing as believers during this time, if indeed this is the time, if the hypothesis turns out to be true. And so I hope to gather many scripture references that will help give us guidance on what we should be about, if in fact God has chosen us to be in the time, in the season of his return. None of this is catching him off guard. He is in total control. Shalom.